You are listening to the War on the Rocks podcast on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. You know the routine if you're a regular listener. My name is Ryan Evans, the founder of War on the Rocks, and I'm sitting here with your favorite and mine, Mike Kaufman. Mike, thanks for joining us again on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
We're here to talk about Ukraine, obviously. Let's start with the most acute battle going on right now at Avdiivka.
Avdiivka has been a somewhat fitful fight that's been ongoing since October. You know, the initial big Russian push there over the fall wasn't successful. They lost quite a bit of equipment. I think their losses have crept up into 500 plus pieces of equipment at this point. For those who are kind of curious, this is at the level of having lost almost an entire division or something towards a combined arms army. But while the fight stabilized towards the end of the year, I think the last time we really talked about this was around New Year's, Russian forces have, in the past week and a half, have made gains around Avdiivka. And so the situation around Avdiivka is, I would say, stable, but stably bad and trending for the worse, in the sense that Russian forces are making incremental gains. And I still hold to kind of my earlier judgment back in the fall that there's a good chance Avdiivka will eventually be lost.
What does it say about the manpower situation of the Russian army that Putin seems, and associated forces, of course, that Putin seems comfortable throwing all these people into that meat grinder? It doesn't seem like there's any change in the Russian concept of operations. It's just this very relentless willingness to accept lots of casualties approach to war.
So they tried a mechanized breakthrough back in the fall. It failed, and they just took a much more attritional approach. But that being said, for all its shortcomings, what the Russian military was able to do last year, and this is perhaps a wider conversation, is they were able to replace their losses, and they were able to generate several additional units and combined arms armies, so they are able to grind it out over time. And so they've been steadily trying to eat away at the position of Avdiivka. And what it says about the Russian military is that although perhaps effectiveness is not dramatically improved, they still have the numbers and have particularly an advantage in firepower. Russia does not have a huge manpower advantage on the ground. What it does have an advantage in is that it's able to replace its losses and it's able to generate additional units. That's why Ukraine is currently engaged in a very important mobilization debate on what to do for the coming year. But also, Russia has a significant firepower advantage, right? Ukraine was experiencing shell hunger we were last there in November, and it got a lot worse over the last couple of months. And we know that the Russian military is very heavily fires-driven. Now that they've established a 5-to-1 fires advantage at the front.
You believe it's 5-to-1?
Yeah, I believe it's 5-to-1 at this point. It might be trending worse because...
And this, of course, relates to slowed U.S. assistance with Ukraine aid stuck in Congress.
Very much. That's a factor. I think it's a very significant one, and I even saw an announcement the other day of French or somebody saying that they could supply 3,000 shells to Ukraine a month. That's barely a day's worth of ammunition, if you're thinking.
So pretty dire. So Avdiivka falls. Let's say that happens. Let's say your prediction is right, is that eventually Avdiivka falls. What's the sort of next major battle on the front? What do Russian forces do next, or what options do they have next?
Yeah, my own impression is that if Avdiivka falls, it'll probably just even out the front, because Avdiivka was always a natural salient. The issue is probably a bit less of Avdiivka overall and more the other areas where we're trying to advance. Russian forces essentially took Marinka over the course of the past month. Marinka's further down south.
Is that a small town?
Yeah, it's a small town. The reason they were fighting over it is they were trying to get around Vuhledar. Last winter, there was a big fight for Vuhledar. The Russian military failed in that fight, and Marinka will allow them to try to make progress to cut off the ground line of communication to Vuhledar. So they're still kind of at the same pocket, just trying to eat it in a different way. But then further up north, there have been some Russian gains, and it's a little bit of a murky picture right now along Luhansk and the Kharkiv borderline. And so to me, it does seem clear that the Russian priority for this year is to take the rest of the Donbass, focused on Donetsk, but also to return to the position they held in the Kharkiv Oblast before they were pressed out of there back during the Kharkiv offensive, right? So basically get back to the Oskil River and try to put themselves in a position to actually threaten the city of Kharkiv and threaten the key cities in Donetsk from that northern axis. And so they're pushing along the northern part too, at least. So I think overall you see at least three main areas where the Russian military has been trying to slowly press along the front.
Let's talk about the campaign against Ukraine's infrastructure this winter and Russia's efforts to take out key nodes, key infrastructure. How's that proceeding?
So this is a really great question. It proceeded differently than expected, and certainly different from last year.
You were very worried about it.
I was worried about it. A lot of people were worried about it, and for good reason. Russia had stockpiled a lot of drones, a significant number of missiles, but it seems they mostly targeted, instead of critical infrastructure, defense industry, and essentially haven't focused on Ukraine's power grid, but rather have done, I'd say, more of a scattershot campaign. They're trying to, from my point of view, both saturate air defense that's been deployed, and also trying to go after Ukraine's defense industrial capacity, which is a different set of targets. And we can debate why. I mean, I would be I would be a liar if I said I know exactly why they did it differently this year.
Well, it fits with what we understand about Russia's theory of victory in a way, is that to try to reduce Western support, to reduce international support, reduce the political will for countries to keep supporting Ukraine with arms. And then if you winnow down Ukraine's ability to arm itself, then you're able to settle the war on favorable terms for Russia in a couple of years. That's probably the theory of victory, I'm guessing.
Yeah,
especially if Trump were to win. And
sure, I think that they basically at this point have a 3-year plan. They're spending the most they've spent on defense in a very long time this year, in 2024. And at the time, this has become a bit more of a marathon rather than a race. And so they're going after sustainment and what Ukraine would need to do to regenerate capability. And so what's happening this year is you essentially have a contest for reconstitution. And whoever is able to effectively use this year to reconstitute then will have decisive advantages towards the end of 2024 headed into 2025. Right. And that advantage may then be irrecoverable for the other side. It'll be difficult to turn it around. And that's why I think Russian strike campaign has been trying to go after what they think are important sources of Ukrainian industrial capacity and that could be used for reconstitution. And also trying to see what they could do against the air defense deployed and slowly bleeding air defense. Right. They know that along with artillery ammunition, air defense interceptors and munitions is one of those key areas where Ukraine is constantly trying to manage its available arsenal.
This is probably a good segue into the article that you just wrote for War on the Rocks with 2 of your colleagues. You want to tell us about the basic argument there?
Sure. So the article is called Hold, Build, and Strike, a vision for how Ukraine could retake the advantage over 2024. And I wrote it with my colleague Rob Lee Daramasica. And what it basically lays out is essentially, as it advertises, a vision for if the resources were there, right? If Congress was to pass a supplemental, if we actually had the money, what could be done over the course of this year, thinking maybe 18 months out of a more long-term strategy in this war, and what could a theory of success look like that's feasible, right? And what it basically lays out is 3 main pillars. One is kind of hold, which is about fortifying and defending, plus consolidating and rationalizing the Ukrainian forces here, trying to exhaust the Russian forces at the peak of their defense spending, which I think is possible, given some structural challenges the Russian military has. They're materially advantaged, but their advantage isn't decisive. It doesn't just sort of, confer a victory. Like the second is build, and this is a key part. This is essentially reconstituting the Ukrainian military, focusing on force quality, training, and industrial capacity, both there and a bit here in the West. And that would require a lot of resources in order to have an opportunity in 2025 to retake the advantage for some kind of major offensive operation. And the last part is strike, going after Russian critical infrastructure, Russian Air Force, and elements of the Russian economy. This part is about negating some of the Russian advantages and creating problems for them, maybe capitalizing on the campaign last year in the Black Sea. It is not a substitute for a major offensive, just to be clear, and it's not a strategy that by itself will win the war for Ukraine, but is a way of inflicting damage and creating problems for the Russian military while focusing on reconstitution and sort of avoiding bad attritional fights or just localized offensives for the sake of offensives, which are too costly. Basically, the strategy suggests the Ukraine has to husband its resources, fight smartly because we don't know what kind of resources are going to be available in 2025, to try to put Ukraine in a favorable position in 2025, right, to be able to maybe retake the initiative and inflict some sort of meaningful defeat on Russia. Bottom line, it's also an important argument because it lays out what is feasible if the resources were there.
We know that Ukraine has to change quite a lot of things to be successful if they follow your advice. The United States and other Western backers do as well. What are some of the recommendations in your piece targeted specifically at Washington? For
Washington, one, we'd have to change the training based on the experience of last year and what we learned to enable Ukraine to scale operations.
Yes, so they're not just operating at a company level, so they actually are operating as battalions and dare we dream brigades that are fighting more coherently.
Absolutely. And just to be clear, it can be done when you're not trying to make a surge effort to conduct an offensive a few months out. When you have a year plus to train, there's a lot you can do when you're not trying to make brigades over the span of 3 months, right?
And this also isn't Ukraine's fault. It's also a shared responsibility of the kind of training that the West was delivering.
Right. Another one's defense industrial capacity. Investments have been made. Some have been very sluggish, particularly in the European side. But it is improving, and we could be in a very different place come 2025 in terms of output of artillery ammunition, of other key munitions, and also investment in Ukraine's industrial production of drones, production of key munitions for them, whether it's in Ukraine or let's say just outside of Ukraine, but for them, there's a lot that can be done over the course of a year with the West correctly applies its resources. And so this is the kind of the build part of the argument.
Europe has belatedly realized, I think, what a giant mess it's actually in, and how by under-delivering for their own security and for Ukraine's war effort that they've put themselves in a real hole, especially if Donald Trump wins the next presidential election. And I don't know if they're turning things around quickly enough or if they even can anymore, to be honest with you. But I guess we're about to find out.
So I would say that I think a lot is going to be decided in this war over the course of the next 12 months. And for folks listening,
but at what point wasn't that true, though?
So right, every period in the war is decisive, right?
Yeah.
It's a bit of sophistry to say that this is the turning point, decisive year. Fair. What is that not true? But let me put it a different way. For folks who are focused on the U.S. election, right, and Donald Trump potentially being elected, the good news and the bad news that I have is I think that much will be decided and will have a tremendous sort of inertia that it will cast over the course of this conflict as the trajectory they'll set between this January and the next. And so much of it will already be set in place one way or another.
A lot of this has to do, of course, with what Congress decides to do. Senator Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader, has decided, I'm hearing, I don't know if this is a final decision or still a debate in the Republican conference, to decouple the Ukraine issue from border negotiations, which could make it easier to pass Ukraine aid, but I think it's still an open question. Although it has been interesting, and you can interpret this any way you'd like, to see the president using emergency authorization to give Israel things, including things related to 155 artillery shells, without congressional authorization. Whereas with Ukraine, he keeps going through the normal congressional authorization process. So that's something to watch. It's something that's frustrated even Biden's supporters that he hasn't been going through Congress on that. But anyway, just an observation.
Yeah, I think where I am is that, as far as I understand, it's not a done deal yet either way. But my view has been growing increasingly gloomy over the last couple of months.
Yeah. Let's talk about the maritime picture. Ukraine does have some success to boast of on the Black Sea in terms of keeping shipping lanes open.
Yeah, that's Ukraine's main success. Ukraine's shipping, commercial shipping, particularly through deep water ports like Odessa, jumped significantly after November. I'm talking, this is really a changed picture just over the last 2 months. And the volumes and number of ships traversing the routes just increased dramatically. That's not at pre-war levels, but it's getting up there. And so this is probably the main success story from 2023 that to some extent we've neglected. Now, it's very important for Ukraine's economic vitality and Ukraine's prospects. Is that a solution by itself to a major ground offensive or anything else? No, it isn't. But it's a very big bright spot in the story for last year, which otherwise has sort of been a year of missed opportunities.
I know this isn't either of our area of expertise, but we've had to become a lot more familiar with some of Ukraine's internal political debate as it relates to mobilization and manpower. So walk us through this. This
is a complex topic, but the way I see it is there's currently a debate. There was a proposal that was put out by Ukraine's President Zelenksy that saying that the general staff is looking for 450 to 500,000 men. This is a very, very large number. That's been batted back and forth. There was a bill introduced regarding mobilization that's been rejected on first reading by the Ukrainian legislature. This is one of the core topics, right? If the West is debating financial resources and getting ammunition to Ukraine and these other capabilities, the debate in Ukraine is very much about manpower, right? Ukraine needs to replace the losses from last year and needs to generate additional combat power. To do that, they need more men. But The average age of Ukrainian men in the military has really been creeping up into the 40s. Ukraine, as a matter of policy, has not been mobilizing younger men in their 20s because it's a very small percentage of the demographic. They are Ukraine's future. If you look at Ukraine's sort of demographics on the chart, you will clearly see that there are almost 4 times as many men in their 40s as there are in those early mid-20s. It'll tell you why they have that policy. So this is a very thorny debate. Where we are right now is sadly nowhere, which is that there hasn't been a settled solution yet. The head of Ukrainian Training Command, Major Nikoluk, said that they do have the capacity to train these men. I'm a bit skeptical. I think that we are a bit in a chicken and egg conversation where Ukraine does need to mobilize people just in general to sort out the force and fill out the force for the coming year. But they need to have a sense of the resources they're going to have from the West, because they don't want to mobilize people knowing if they don't know that they have the resources to train and equip them. So we're sort of looking back and forth on each other right now, and this is a critical period in planning. As both sides try to understand the resources they're going to have to work with for the hard political choices that they need to make this year.
Before we return to another thorny Ukrainian political debate that's ongoing right now, I want to call out Europe and specifically the EU for something else, as the EU seems to have tanked G7 discussions to seize $300 billion in Russian assets sitting in various foreign banks, non-Russian banks. That $300 billion could be seized and could finance Ukraine's reconstruction. It could finance Ukraine's war effort. It could take a lot of pressure off of Western industry, Western taxpayers especially, over the long run. And yet the EU has basically decided they're not going to move forward on this, according to press reports. And admittedly, the sources are anonymous, but it's Reuters, which I trust, and some other outlets. I think it's a real missed opportunity. The U.S. should have, and its European partners should have been moving much faster on this to begin with, but that's the whole story of this war, and it's just extremely disappointing. Phil Zellico did a great podcast with Aaron Stein on this for us. That's part of Unspent Rounds, which is a members-only podcast, but we published it for free, and Phil's been one of the leading voices on this. So just another opportunity that Europe has missed.
So what I would add is, I'm not sure how easily those funds could be spent on military assistance, but I know that overall, of course, they could be very much spent
definitely
on
reconstruction.
Yeah, and just to be clear, we're debating funding often.
And keeping the government going, which...
Yeah, a lot of it is economic assistance and financial assistance for the government. Even the supplemental being debated by Congress, of that $60 billion, I think only 30 is on the military side, and the other half is aimed towards economic assistance. So it would make a very significant dent in that bill.
Just another dumb European strategic misdecision. Anyway, we're recording this on a Monday afternoon, and the debate du jour, and so keep in mind, you'll be listening to this at the earliest sometime on Tuesday afternoon, I think. So I don't know which way this will end up turning out, but General Zaluzhny, the commander-in-chief of Ukrainian forces, was going to be fired. And I'm not going to throw this on anyone else. This isn't something I got from Mike, but I'm telling you, and you might be frustrated to hear this, but the truth is that Zelensky was planning to fire the guy. This was in the works. This is not disputable. I'm not going to tell you how I know this. You can either trust me or not, but it was in the works. It then got leaked. I don't know by who, but it was leaked by very credible people to very credible journalists. And then now I don't know what's going to happen. It's going to be a very unpopular move, both in Ukraine, where Zaluzhny is very popular, and also internationally, where he's seen as a seasoned, capable military commander. And again, this is just Ryan's personal view. I think this would be disastrous. I think a lot of the mistakes that we saw in 2013, particularly around sticking to Bakhmut and the human and equipment costs that it imposed on Ukraine and some other things, this came from Zelensky, from what I understand, not from Zaluzhny. So to hold him accountable for the failed 2023 offensive is nonsense, in my view. And another thing, apparently a lot of people on Twitter were not aware of this, and I'm sorry that you weren't, but it's, literally the worst kept secret in Ukraine. It's not even a secret. It's openly discussed all the time. Zelensky, for about 2 years now, has been very afraid of a presidential challenge from Zaluzhny. So this cannot be separated from the political threat that he saw from him. And it also speaks to the really poor civil-military relations and how that's affected the campaign that we've been seeing in Ukraine. And we're told by certain Western analysts, who I shall not name, oh, don't talk about this. It's the same ones that don't want to talk about any problems that Ukraine has. They only want to talk about the good stuff. But that's not what this podcast is for. So anyway, Ryan's rant is over. Mike, I'll just ask you this. You have studied this war very closely. I believe you met Zaluzhny on a past research trip. What is your impression of him as a commander?
To me, his reputation rang true. He's very charismatic. Of the challenges and problems that I saw in Ukraine's offensives and Ukraine's operations, I did not think that Zaluzhny and his leadership were among them. And I don't know what problem his removal solves other than the very thorny civil relations that had sort of burst out into the open ever since Zaluzhny's November interview in The Economist. And for any of you who have not been seeing the sort of back and forth that's been happening the last couple of months, the situation clearly deteriorated, I think, between the commander-in-chief and the president. So I think for many of us who have been watching this war and have been to Kyiv over the past year or 2 years, that this kind of thing was looming, that is, it was very much in the offing. So what I'll say about Zaluzhny, just my impression of him was that he was a military thinker, oriented around technology, concepts, doctrine, also very much vested in the fundamentals. You can tell that from the way he spoke and also what he wrote and published. And for those interested, welcome to read his articles in The Economist and other places. And lastly, yes, he was very charismatic and very much liked by the men. So I think that his removal will be deeply unpopular across the Ukrainian military. And that should not come as a surprise to anyone. And I'm not sure how appointing someone new fixes any of these big questions on mobilization, on what the Ukrainian strategy should be. But my job is to analyze, and so I'll look to see how the situation plays out.
I guess we'll see. Hopefully Zelensky reverses course, but maybe we'll know by the time this episode comes out. Thank you for listening to this episode of the War on the Rocks podcast. Don't forget to check out our membership program where, among other things, you get to listen to Mike on the Russia contingency, which is one of several members-only shows that we offer as a part of our membership. Thank you for listening. Stay safe and stay healthy.